nothing, and there's no way we ever could. Now we see everything that's going wrong with the world and those who lead it. We just feel like we don't have the means to rise above and be.
So we keep on waiting, waiting, waiting on the world to change. We keep on waiting, waiting, waiting on the world to change. It's hard to beat the system when we're standing at a distance. So we keep on waiting, waiting, waiting on the world to change.
Now if we had the power to bring our neighbors home from war, they would never miss a Christmas. No more ribbons on the door. When you trust your television, what you get is what you got. Cause when they only information, oh, they can blend it all they want.
That's why we're waiting, waiting, waiting on the world to change. We keep on waiting, waiting, waiting on the world to change. It's not that we don't care, we just know that the fight ain't fair. So we keep waiting, waiting, waiting on the world to change.
Participated in numerous events, including the National Day of Prayer at the White House and the BET Awards. So virtual round of applause to our beautiful singers, and we will play them again later in the show so you can get a little bit more inspiration as we get started. There's a lot of excellent chat that's happening in the chat function. I just wanted to encourage everybody to continue to use that. Tell us who you are, where you're from, and highlights from day one of the summit for those of you who are with us. If you are just joining us today, let us know what you're excited about for today. Be sure that you select all participants when introducing yourself. So now, without further ado, please welcome the President and CEO of USGBC and GBCI to kick us off, Mahesh Ramanujam.
Hey, thank you, Ryan. Thank you, everyone. Good morning, and thank you all for participating in our first ever USGBC Social Equity Summit. We had overwhelming support heading into the summit, and hundreds of people were able to join us yesterday for an incredibly powerful day of listening and learning. Day one was a chance to hear ideas from leaders across our USGBC community. We heard a wide array of issues across 4 themes: governance, affordability and empowerment, accessibility, and out of the box. This was an opportunity to hear how the USGBC community is putting together concepts of equity into real practice through projects at companies and in programs. Yesterday, I spoke about how invisibility is a big problem in the sustainability movement. And throughout the day, we heard from all of you time and again how inclusivity is key to moving forward. It is clear that all of us understand to make someone more visible, you need to include them in the process. Yesterday's presentations shared ideas and guiding principles for how our community is trying to do this by bringing new and different stakeholders into the process of developing green buildings communities. We also heard how inclusion is not just about giving people the opportunity to talk, but to influence the planning process and benefit from the outcome. It's also about turning equity into something long-term and iterative. Just like you need to review the LEED certification requirements many times while working on a project, you need to constantly review equity. In the most successful instances, a truly collaborative partnership transforms the community from being affected by a project into becoming the actual owners of that project. Visibility is also incredibly important because it is required to scale. When it comes to green building, scalability happens when you can prove economic viability and resilience in the places where successful projects are unexpected. We heard examples of this yesterday in low-income housing zones and our own LEED-certified orphanage in Haiti. To succeed in these contexts, you need to be incredibly well-versed in the benefits from a community perspective for their buy-in and in the economics perspective for clients and developers to buy in. It is precisely when we understand that we are all part of a community, then it is imperative to include all people from the community in accessing the benefits of the work. That is how we leapfrog and set a new standard around equity. Now, if day one was about shaping and sharing accomplishments and best practices within our community, today will be about listening to expert challengers, leading voices on equity from outside our community who will push us and challenge our traditional thinking. No one is more excited to hear from these presenters than myself. We are so honored to be joined by this incredible group of equity champions. This is the exact reason we held the USGBC Equity Summit in the first place, to hear from those outside our traditional orbit. This afternoon, challengers and community members will come together in action breakout groups to discuss the ideas submitted for consideration and which ideas should be prioritized. If you'd like to participate, please remember to fill out the survey by 11 o'clock this morning to ensure you are assigned to a breakout session. We will leave these 2 days energized and with a new sense of purpose. We'll have surfaced our best ideas, listened to different perspectives, deeply engaged in the work necessary to ensure our vision is complete and our ability to execute is robust, and started a roadmap for USGBC equity going forward. I thank you for joining us today again, and I'm excited to continue to learn from all of you today. And importantly, in the second generation of USGBC, we must go from awareness to adoption and accelerate on all fronts. This means our USGBC community should get started this Monday morning on how we will incorporate equity in everything we do. Thank you all.
Thank you, Mahesh, for our morning inspiration. Again, we appreciate you always kicking us off, and you launched this and announced this at Greenbuild, and it's so great that we could be here virtually together. So we're going to move into the next section, which is really a summary for yesterday. Mahesh said, this is all about listening and learning. You guys are here to help us define a new standard of living for all. So yesterday we had a lot of great conversations. We know that many of you were there. Some of you are new joining us today. So for the benefit of all, we're going to give you a bit of a summary of what happened yesterday. So day one summary. Yesterday's discussions were led by our Keepers of the Heart. We had over 60 proposals. 17 of them were presented on yesterday. So a warm round of welcome to all of our Keepers of the Heart who have joined us again today. The Keepers of the Heart will go through and give a summary of all of the topics that have happened and all the discussions that have happened in their groups. We had governance, we had affordability and economic empowerment, we had equitable access, and we had out of the box. So the two Keepers of the Heart for each of these sections will kind of summarize what happened and give their thoughts in that summary for the benefit of all this morning. But we want to welcome a new set of champions and challengers to the scene this morning. These champions and challengers, as we've said, are folks who have really led the charge of environmental and social justice, community development, economic empowerment out in the field. We welcome you all today, and we want to quickly introduce who each of these people are. After this, each summary that we go through from our Keepers of the Heart, we're asking our champions and challengers to ask questions, to probe a little bit further into what was presented, to learn from them. We will then hear from these champions and challengers again very distinctly later on in the day. So quickly, to run through who we have on the docket, we have Antoine Bryant, Director of Strategic Partnerships with the National Organization of Minority Architects and Project Manager of Business Development for Moody Nolan. We have Dr. Atyia Martin, CEO and founder of All Access, Inc. If you joined us at the Communities and Affordable Homes Summit in Boston, you may recognize her from there as well. Denise Fairchild, President and CEO of Emerald Cities Collaborative. Dianne Dillon Ridgely, Board of Directors for Interface, Inc. Euneika Rogers-Sipp is going to be joining us later. She's not able to join us in this morning part, but she's the founder of Destination School for Agricultural Estates and a Distinguished Fellow for Community Building at Groundswell. Jerome Ringo, Chairman of Zostic Global and Global Ambassador for Trade and Investment for the Pan-African Parliament. Majora Carter, CEO of the Majora Carter Group and owner of the Boogie Down Grind Cafe. Nathaniel Smith, founder and Chief Equity Officer for Partnership for Southern Equity. Nori Catabay, Green Building Team Program Manager for King County. Ozzie Gonzales, independent business owner at P3 Consulting, and Ron Hantz, president of the board of directors for the Network for Developing Conscious Communities. So those are our challengers. I'm going to turn it over to our first governance panel keepers of the heart, George Bandy and Susan Kaplan.
Thank you, Ryan. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
First, I want to thank Mahesh for creating this incredible forum and for Kimberly, Ryan, and Heather for making it happen. I also want to thank Joel for sharing with us what USGBC's Social Equity Working Group has been thinking about and putting into place over the last 10 years for USGBC. And I want to thank the speakers who gave such thoughtful and heartfelt presentations. And the audience, this was one of the most engaged and passionate group discussions I've ever heard since USGBC was a teenager and all the hormones were going wild. The discussions, virtual of course, were wonderfully messy, and the desire to build something new and better was palpable. It reminds me of an essay that I recently read about cocoons. We always think about the caterpillar becoming the butterfly. Maybe in this case, it's the building, but it is so much more about the process. The author was talking about the pandemic in this case, but it's also about our process of creating. The caterpillar must actually turn to mush in its journey. It has to completely lose itself to become that beautiful, lovely butterfly. And that is what we're doing here, talking about the process of creating beautiful outcomes. In our case, with George and I's panel, governance, it was totally about the process, the critical way we structure change. We started by discussing change within an organization, in this case, the way USGBC addresses affordable housing. Then we heard about process two government organizations had developed to create a bigger tent for decision making. And lastly, change within a design firm to incorporate a process to address equity. And there were some kind of universal points. Language matters. Language can be off-putting, can be seen as a code or stop discussion. People see a word differently. George talked about semantics issue. We all want good things for our families and communities, and how we talk about it is so extremely important. We have to be honest in what we're trying to use language to say. Maybe we use it to obfuscate and end potential for change. And we need to engage all affected parties. We need to have a process. We need to meet people where they are. We need to build trust. We need a range of perspectives. We need to be humble, open, vulnerable, have a truthful approach to engagement, not one of convincing the community that you think you know what's best for them. And we need to have no assumptions. We need to be willing to pivot away from what you originally started with. And I think this group is one that can do this quite well, and I know we'll be doing this all day. And now I'll turn it over to George Bandy to continue the discussion.
Wow, Susan, I don't know if there's much left. Thank you for that analogy and connection to nature. It's always good for us to be able to kind of share some things. I think one of the incredible things that was manifested yesterday was to hear people connecting technical acumen and work from your heart. And when you have a commitment from both, the manifestation of the work feels so much better in the space. In the area of governance, which we were responsible for, I feel like the summary really kind of coined a lot of different things. I'm just going to try to give some highlights of the things that were critical. In the affordable housing section as it related to USGBC, some of the things that we talked about was semantics. Are we talking to the right people? Are we engaging the right folks? Are we communicating at the right level? And in governance, one of the things that we've learned is that being able to be a part of a governing process is one thing, but being able to adapt that process to fit a lot of different multiple stakeholders is something altogether different. And one of the things I digested from that was not one size fits all. We need to be able to create a governance platform and a strategy and ability to be able to communicate, but also to be able to understand that the dynamics need to be fluid, and we need to transition those dynamics to make sure that we're meeting the goals or the intended purpose of what we're trying to do, and not just creating governance for governance sake. that affordable housing thing really resonated with me. I did some research on those three bodies that we talked about yesterday to find out the connections and understanding, and that was a real big gap for us to make sure that we get connected with that and be on the front of that rather than kind of drinking from the fire hose, so to speak. I think the second thing was kind of assessing the current state. A lot of the information from Richard and Nori, the way that they had that technical acumen and being able to do those layers of information over the process and creating that governing component that allowed us to be able to see things visually was critically important. I think that there was a lot of value in understanding that process and creating a methodology that allowed us to be able to assess things from the appropriate perspective to make sure that we engage the right people to create the correct governance. And also the equitable communication, that one size does not fit all with the young lady from Richmond, Kendria. It was one of the presentations that I kind of slept with. I guess, you know, one of the things it's a bad thing when you sleep with presentations on your mind because you don't rest well. But it was being able to see the connectivity of engagement with the right people to create the right governance to then yield the right results for that community is something that's was incredibly attractive about that particular process and the way that she yielded that information. And I was so happy to see also some of the holistic approaches to looking at engaging other organizational type of structures like HKS and the architectural, because architectural firms are going to be a big part of this process, always have been, and to have them engaged and also being in the forefront of making these connections so we're able to look at the practitioners in the AIA that are looking at this equity component and the social justice component in a different way, especially in the way that we design things with all of the stuff that we're seeing right now. It's going to be critically important to have them engaged on the front side of development and process and thinking about this particular equitable faction in the way that they design these communities and have impact in these particular areas. Some of the universal points that resonated with me is, how do you build trust with this multifaceted group of organizers that USGBC is going to be working with to develop this social equity component? Meeting people where they are while you're building trust, which is sometimes a great challenge. Finding the appropriate bridge between the semantics of the goal of USGBC and its charge and embodying the goal of this social equity component that will be added to that charge. I don't think it's as far of a stretch as people have created it to be. I think that there's some natural connectivity with these particular components. It's just about adding the right context for people to be able to see this conversation in a different light, being truthful in our approach and engagement, to be honest up front and say, here's where we're going to start and then begin to see things progress is critically important. That's one of the things I also gathered from the governance component. And don't take assumptions and be able to pivot. A lot of times, we make assumptions about what can be done or what's possible rather than coming to the table with an open palate and being able to digest things in a different way. So a lot of excitement. I won't try to go into the other presentations that happened during the day, but all of them were really, really good. I will say this, Mahesh always challenges the organization to be disruptive. And I think that this manifestation of something that Kimberly says we initiated in 2005 is a disruptive time, not just for us personally, but for the world in a different way. And so what better time for us to be disruptive and begin to engage in this particular dialogue to make equity a bigger part and a greater part of what USGBC offers as a part of its connection to its community and its relationship internationally. So the ability to look at these strategies and move forward is going to be good and create some goals and credits. And I think mapping and engaging and making sure that you're able to measure this in a different way is going to be critically important to the success of this opportunity. So it's been a pleasure, of course, to work with Susan in this particular regard and to see all of these people who have been keepers of the heart and the organizational leadership from USGBC. So we'll open it up for conversation. I think we got some space for questions, but thank you guys for allowing us to be a part of this, and I look forward to being engaged and throughout the process.
Yeah, so now I'll turn it over to our challengers. There we go. Questions, comments, thoughts that you have from the summary given by George and Susan.
So this is Denise Fairchild, Emerald Cities Collaborative. Thank you so much. It seemed as if it was a very fruitful conversation that you had yesterday. I'm sorry I wasn't a part of that. So a couple of things strike me. And the ideas of equity, we're really getting very good at principles, policies, thinking about processes and plans, and we're really doing very little about turning that into practice. And I think that's part of the push that I want, and I'll probably talk about it later in my presentation. How do we get it practice? But the other kind of thing that relates to this is, sounds like you're talking about governance from the hierarchy of community engagement. Is at the lowest ladder of community engagement. It's about informing, communicating, educating, having convenings, getting input. It's not at the higher level of the equity scale, which is really how do you co-govern. We talk about in our work energy democracy. That means how do we co-govern, on a project or in our community, and that means about partnerships. It's really about control. It's about an equity stake. How do we get higher up that ladder of community engagement? And then some of the other criteria that I think would be important to consider is not only co-governance, but how do you make sure that whatever project you're engaged in, that you're leaving something behind, and then for that community, and then secondly, how are you bringing people along, moving people into a space that you've created and not abandoning them, but bringing them into new pathways.
Thank you, Ms. Fairchild, and good to see you. I totally agree. I think that it will require some.
I muted myself. I can talk.
I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I think it will require a couple things. I think it will require collaboration and partnership. I think it will require people coming to the table with humility and dignity to be able to kind of come to the table with, here are the tools that we feel like we're really good at, and here are the tools that we're not really good at. And how do we bring these tools together to create the type of governance and the level of execution around governance that you spoke of at a level in which is going to have the type of impact that we're looking to have. I think that this is an initial conversation to begin to foster that, and the work that's being done to bring this conversation together is a catapulting of being able to go back and revisit this and say, who are we not partnering with appropriately to be able to engage people who are in a leadership position around USGBC to these organizations that we are not currently partnering with, to be able to co-govern and be able to speak to things in a different way and not be working against each other, but to be working in alignment. And sometimes that requires humility, and it's difficult from time to time, but I think that we're at a place where there are some things that will humble you whether you want to be humbled or not. And I think that has occurred in this regard and in some other global regards that allow you to be able to reflect a little bit and see things in a different way. But I totally agree that it has to be at a place where it's at a high level, where you target that specific level so it can cascade the type of results that you want. And there are organizations that are in a position to be able to do that. And I think USGBC is one of those organizations that just has to partner with those organizations that can actually co-govern and bring about the change that we want to see.
George, this is Dianne. Can I be here?
Yes, ma'am. How are you?
How are you? I can see myself, but I'm still working with all the details. I'm very impressed with the quality and the capacity, because I've done a lot of other meetings that just sort of serial Anyway, this has been great. And yesterday was so rich, which is the only thing I want to say right now, as opposed to when I have my actual time to talk. But Denise sort of opened it up. Yesterday was so rich, and I can't ignore the climate of what's going on. We're all sitting sort of on a, not a tinderbox, but on a fine wire, whatever the right metaphor is, with all that's going on in the country. So the discussion and the focus could not be more urgent and more poignant. And it's as though everything is coming together and everything is falling apart all at once. So it is not only timely, but it is appropriate that those of us who've had our arms in massaging and working on these issues, for me, it's been almost 40 years of doing this, to see finally how those things that always we say, well, she does human rights and civil rights, and she does environment and green stuff, and she does stuff on gender, and she does stuff on governance and policy. And I've been trying to say all along what both my grandmothers taught me, that it's all the agenda for taking care of people with love, with compassion, with care, with justice, with equity. And finally, it's though this moment has come where somehow we've been able to pull back the covers and shine and let the sun shine in, or some sort of light. You get the point of where I'm going with the metaphors. It's a moment for us to be able to not have these in silos and different places, but to finally understand that it is all a single agenda. And to go back to the quote of the 19th century Reverend Parker, Theo Parker, about the arc of justice, since he was the actual originator of that. Maybe we are here in this moment being able to see that arc, and not just see it, but make sure that we make it bend a whole lot faster and bend towards justice and equity, because we now live in a world that will no longer tolerate vast amounts of injustice and disparity. And because it's not right, it's not necessary, and people will just not stand for it anymore. I don't want to take too much time because I know I have a few minutes later on, but I just wanted to inject that. I think I need to now figure out how to remute myself.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Dianne. And I think that really is at the core of the issue, is how do we really integrate equity into all that USGBC does, and not have a credit here, a little program there, have it something that everyone thinks about for every project, or even every time they look at USGBC's work and their programs, even if they're not part of the lead system.
Good morning. This is Atyia Martin.
Good morning.
All Aces Inc. I just want to say thank you for having me as part of this discussion. It does sound like yesterday was very rich. I wasn't a part of it. Apologize that I couldn't be there with you all. And I want to lift up a couple of things that have been said up to this point, and just kind of call out the idea that when we talk about systems change, right, part of the system is us as individuals. People create organizations, people create policies, people create cultures in organizations, whether they do it intentionally or not, and which brings me to this piece around intentionality. So when we're talking about equity, it is not something that ever happens by accident, right? It has never, and it never will. And so this idea of making sure that as we're talking about what we need to do, that it's partially, there's work as individuals we need to do. So having humility is a skill. Being able to communicate well is a skill, and that includes listening. Being able to practice disruptive to oppression habits is a skill, or a set of skills. And so this piece around making sure that we can see ourselves as individuals in the mirror, and how when we collectively come together in organizations on projects, that we can also see our collective selves in that mirror and manage ourselves better, right? So it's easy to see the system as something outside of ourselves, as something that we're not a part of, as something that we can point our finger at somebody else or some other organization about what they're doing and what they're not doing, as opposed to our ability to see ourselves very clearly so that we can manage ourselves better. And what I mean by that is this acknowledgement that we have a human condition, a set of human conditions that causes us to default to certain behaviors and habits that are actually conductors of oppression. And so if we're honest about that, then it frees us up to be more honest and be able to see with more clarity the complexity as well as the opportunities to make change in the spaces that we actually have influence over. One of the impacts of oppression is that everyone feels like we're powerless, right? People of color feel powerless. White people feel like they're powerless. What are we supposed to do? There's nothing I can do. And that's the thing that helps to perpetuate it in everyday life for all of us. So I'll stop there because we have time later. But I just wanted to add that into the layers of complexity and nuance that we need to be integrating.
Thank you.
I was going to say, Denise, Dianne, and Atyia, thank you so much for breaking the ice with this. I have the thankless job of trying to moderate this and keep us all on time so we have enough time for everybody else. But George and Susan, just a few moments, if there's any kind of like final thoughts that you have from this, because I do want to give time to our next summary.
So, Susan, you want to go first? I always have to defer to the queens.
I just think that's really poignant what Atyia was just talking about, how we all have to start with ourselves, and we've all kind of separated out our personal lives and our professional lives in the past. And I think it's so critical, especially now, maybe redefine that. And as we are mushing those lines together and start trying to use our personal values to bring to our work, all the work we do.
So I'll close with this statement, Ryan, is as passionate as I am about disruption, I'm probably even more passionate about getting to the place where equity is not a set aside. It is encumbered in every aspect of what USGBC does from a disruptive standpoint in terms of its building for the next iteration of healthy, well, green space and how it should be a core part of every thought of every process that we bring into the space. And so I think the governance aspects allows you to be able to partner and work and develop that type of agenda and spirit so that you're able to manifest those results within every aspect of the organization. And that's what disruption should look like. And it's going to make a lot of people uncomfortable. And I think Mahesh is up for that challenge. I know that Kimberly is. I know that my buddy Ryan is always a little stick of dynamite waiting to erupt. So I'm looking forward to seeing the fulfillment of this opportunity really come into some executionable real items as soon as possible, and then turning that into a cascading of opportunities that really has an impact. Is far too bad and far too gone right now for us to be apathetic. So I'm challenging us to really kind of look at this and make some movements sooner rather than later. And it's starting with myself. I'm starting to challenge myself in a different way as well.
Stick of dynamite ready to erupt. I appreciate that one, George. Put that in my bio. All right, so excellent. So thank you all. We're going to continue the conversation now, moving into affordability and economic empowerment. This is Marge and Jennifer, I believe, right?
Emily.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, I'm sorry. We have Jennifer and Sarah. I think.
We can jump in if you're ready for it.
Let's go for it.
Sorry, I spoke for you. Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Okay, great. So I'm just going to start us off. Yes, I could hardly sleep last night. I was so excited, which excited is not hard to imagine with me. I'm high energy myself, a fellow stick of dynamite. But you know, as a mother, that usually since motherhood, I'm cured of insomnia. But there's just so much richness in what we covered yesterday, and so much work to do. So my name is Jennifer Sheffield, and the easiest way to remember me is that I'm the one living and working in the Galilee region of Israel, specifically in the Arab Society. And I'm going to touch first on some transformation that's happening in Cleveland, and I'll talk a little bit later about the session that everyone is talking about from Nori's session. So for the GCP, the Greater Cleveland Partnership, they are working to embed equity in all of what they do, and they're using this 14-category framework of the global diversity and inclusion benchmarks. Their categories include sustainability, which they're calling as like green building, energy efficiency, as well as community, government, and social responsibility, so promoting equitable economic growth in historically underserved communities, as well as supplier diversity and then workforce inclusion. And they're working to connect people of color to opportunities in the construction industry, and they're using community benefit agreements. And I think some of us would like to get some of the details on what are in those agreements. Their belief is that communities are stronger with greater racial equity, and they have a large focus on impact investment, which is something that we'll be hearing a lot of. They look for projects that really align with their community goals and priorities. They look to create permanent jobs as well as inclusive and affordable housing, and projects that support local and historically underserved businesses and entrepreneurs, as well as those that improve the health, well-being, healthy food access, green standards, et cetera. And one thing that they promote that I think is really important to note is that their advisory board includes community members from these low-income communities that actually are involved in the decision-making process. So not just the input, but they actually get to decide where the funding is going to based on the community needs, not just the end user, but the entire community and all of the different criteria that they set forth. So they have people in that community who are making decisions into how that community is impacted. And then I will let Sarah go ahead and present to or summarize the second one.
Sure. So next up was Amy and Gail from Gensler on the 4 steps forward for inclusion. Really dug into how they can update the LEAD inclusive design pilot should be a prereq, create education opportunities in the community, having people go out and volunteer in schools. Also talked about partnering with community and professional organizations, all about engagement, also with local municipal code developers. Let's see what else. That the intent is there and the heart is there as far as the A&D community, but that there needs to be more concisive as well as just being more engaged with who the stakeholders are. Also convening accessibility and inclusive advisory committees and sharing information more widely and making it more accessible so that people can find it. They do feel like this is something that is disruptive. And hopefully today we can talk about how this can be scaled more and that it can also be used for existing as well as new construction. Jennifer, you want to talk about the third one?
Yes, great, thank you. So this one, also one that kept me up at night, the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative. So this is a group of like 200 members that partner together to, in a multi-stakeholder process that's people of color-led, community-led. It takes land and housing off the speculative market to create permanently affordable community-controlled land and housing. So this is a cooperative model, and they have different types of owners or members, community owners that run the community programs, investment owners that invest in the solutions, resident owners that could be perpetual renters, but also stakeholders in the process. And this is sort of a model that hasn't been seen before. And, just think of, as Kimberly said, fragmentation doesn't get us to scale, but if you imagine how real estate could transform into a more cooperative model between real estate developers and design professionals, equity and green building and other, full design functionality to inclusive design. So with the community in ways that not just extract the value, which is the point she made, not just extract the value from that land or from that market, but create value together that can be shared with that community. And I first learned of this sort of cooperative development idea from a friend and colleague of mine, Max Anheuser, a few years ago, and we discussed, we even explored potential projects to work on in the surrounding area of Philadelphia. And in our mind, and I just want to throw this as a segue to the question I want to pose to USGBC and challengers. So in our mind, creating value for that community could be things like we looked at a neighborhood that might be a good fit for urban farming. And we did a farm plan to calculate how many jobs that could create that would be filled by local residents, and how you might have like a solar panel community garden that could be shared through that neighborhood. So there are interesting ways to monetize the development and share those benefits, not only financial, but community benefits together. And I would pose that as a potential option for really combating gentrification and displacement by having community involved in not just in a project that's coming into their neighborhood, but that actually supports their livelihood and they are involved in the day-to-day operations and maintenance of that project. So what I want to, my question to USGBC and for our challengers to think through with us would be, how would USGBC play a role in, if that would be a transformative, disruptive paradigm shift that we would want to engage in? What would be USGBC's role, and how could we take that model and expand it, nationwide, or that sort of concept, or maybe it's an idea that generates another idea for a concept that could be truly, disruptive. And now I'll turn it back over to Sarah, and I'm sure we'll have more to talk about on that one.
Yeah. And then our fourth presentation was from Ganesh on equity and design and rethinking disability. One thing that I love that he talked about was recognizing the difference in others, that equity should be a seamless transition, and talking about visibility, being visible in public space, how the feeling of shame and being invisible comes when spaces are not designed with this in mind. Also talked about how do we go beyond ADA and universal design. Also, what can USGBC do to incentivize design for disability by introducing prerequisites, addressing it in LEED, and also that sustainability is more than just green building, healthy materials, and energy efficiency. Truly sustainable spaces are truly inclusive and accessible, and sustainability is closer to real life. It's a brand of interconnected threads. With all these presentations, a common theme was definitely community, interconnectedness, of course, equal access, and designing for other people in mind.
Excellent. Thank you both for your summaries. We're going to turn it over to our champions and challengers to get a few reactions, thoughts, questions from you about those presentations. So that give the floor to our champions and challengers.
So this is Nori Catabay from King County, Seattle, Washington area.
Nori.
Hey there.
Yeah. Hi. So I really enjoyed the presentations in this segment, particularly from the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative. And one of the things that I think we can challenge ourselves is try to figure out, how do we promote requirements or practices that could foster the intent that they set out of restorative economics, heal people power, land without landowners, and just as was described, that community participation and representation, how can we promote requirements that could get us to those outcomes would be a really great thing.
Yeah. Hi, this is Majora. Can you hear me? I can't tell if anything's there.
Oh, we can.
Oh, okay, good. I too was also really impressed by what East Bay was actually working on in particular. But I think, and so first of all, thank you very much for the work that you put into actually, and all the everybody else, the presenters put into this. But I still feel as though we're missing, a huge piece of why low status communities are still struggling the way they are. I mean, granted, people like East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperatives absolutely have hit on the fact that it is about real estate. It is about land. Real estate can be used as a transformational tool. But one of the reasons why I think, I know I was impacted by East Bay is because it was people in those communities actually doing the real estate development themselves. And that is often, and it's still, real estate is still considered this rather elusive thing that someone from the outside needs to come in and do. Like to be as a Black female developer, we shouldn't be considered unicorns, but we are. And that in and of itself is the biggest challenge that I think we're facing as a country. That development is considered this like crazy little thing that only a certain number of people can do. And often what ends up happening is this type of development that happens in our own communities, is honestly the type that continues to exacerbate all of the very specific issues that happens when you concentrate poverty. And, from health outcomes to low educational attainment and all of those things. And so I think ultimately we do need to think about how would USGBC, how do design professionals, instead of just talking about, how equity is super important, are we willing to go into whether it's in, to state, city, federal philanthropy, and be like, maybe we should reduce the cost of access to capital so that there could be more folks within those communities actually doing some of the development themselves. And how do we use our resources to make sure that we're not just doing engagement, which makes everybody feel good, but doesn't really play out in terms of real projects that improve the quality of life, in particular economically for folks, because in case we haven't noticed, the wealth gap has increased between whites and people of color in this country, even though there's been tons of money spent in those communities. And I feel like if we don't actually look at that and acknowledge it, then why bother?
This is Atyia Martin. Thank you, Majora. That was actually where I was going as well. And only thing I'll add is the economic development benefits that we usually think of. And then there's the planning, the process, the implementation, the outcomes, every part of the process, not just having to the point around engagement, but that we're really looking at how are we also spending our money throughout the process, right? So if we're having meetings, we should be spending money with organizations in the community. We should be figuring out whatever money we're investing in communities, like that money actually gets into the hands of people in the community. So there's a lot of projects that happen, to Majora's point, where that money comes into the neighborhood but never actually ends up in the hands of people in the community. And it seems like there's a perception of that we need to save people, that we need to, it's charity. When it's not charity, people don't need sympathy. What they need is a return on their investment. People have been investing in their cities, in their states, in the United States, for generations, and in many cases before some other people got there into their communities. And so this idea of making sure that as we talk about these issues, that we're really thinking about it from the perspective of these people are partners. These people have talents and skills and resilience and have been doing things in their communities since before we are showing up. And so how do we make sure that we're also being respectful of those things, and that they're not just getting the burdens of all the stuff we're doing, to actually benefiting beyond the specific outcome of the project. And that the last thing I'll say is when we talk about measuring impact, that we make sure that the people who are on the receiving end of the impact are actually part of the decision makers on whether or not it was successful, right? We can come up with all the measures we want to come up with that are check boxes for us to say that it was an amazing project and it was great and it met all these standards that we came up with. But if it doesn't include the experience of the community as they were trying to navigate and be a part of it, if it doesn't include whether or not people felt like they got what they needed from the project, then can we really say a project was a success if we don't have that as part of our metrics?
This is Dianne. I want to put something in right here, and I wanted to build on what both Atyia and Majora were saying. When I was listening to the presentation and they were talking about the advisory board, and people were they were amazed that that's me that's making that noise? Okay. My question was, do people at the board have the veto power? Because if they can suggest, that's great. But ultimately, who has the veto power on how a project or work or change goes forward? That's when it's really an equitable partnership. And the other thing that I just wanted to bring up, at some point we have to acknowledge the history, and not just sort of in a generic sense, but the intentional, layered disenfranchisement that happened with the GI Bill, with all of those other things. Sometimes we just talk about them and glaze over them because we often don't bring into the conversation currently that the long track way of wealth creation in this country has been from individual home ownership or land ownership, whether it was when we were back as an agrarian society and it was the landed gentry, or currently. And so the fact that we have multiple dwelling houses, that we have so many people who don't own the property, that we still have an inherited, archaic at this point, taxing structure that supports the benefits of those finances going to the owners, not the ones who necessarily live in the properties. So at some point, we've got to unpack or unplot or rediagram, or at least at the minimum, analyze how all of this institutional structure impacts the capacity for us to be able to make the kinds of changes that we're talking about. And Ryan, you keep offering for us to comment now, but what's going to be left for us to talk about when we get our section?
You reinforce your theme, Dianne.
I wanted to throw in this idea. I too resonate with the idea of the East Bay development work around cooperative development. And for me, I think we need a cultural shift. We really need to start thinking about the conversations that are happening at the community level, which is about the notion of the commons, and that the privatization and the commodification of land, of energy, of everything that we share as a species and ecosystem has to shift, because we're at capacity, the holding capacity of the globe, and the disproportionate consumption of all of our natural resources that's producing the income inequality and the wealth disparity. There's got to be a huge cultural shift around the notions of sharing resources and the commons. So the community land trust, community housing, community-owned businesses and cooperatives is a model of the future. It's the only way that we are going to address the challenges of climate change and find a way to develop the social cohesion and the interdependence that's required of our community, and shortening our supply chain, as we see what's happening with COVID, and building local sustainable food economies as opposed to being on these grids where we can't get the supply to the people that need them. We need a huge shift, and using the commons as a framework for that is part of a way to really think disruptively.
Hi, it's Majora again. I'm sorry. I absolutely, Denise, when you talk, I'm like, oh my God, yes. But at the same time, somebody, so much in this country is just rooted on the fear, whether it's Blackness or poverty. We've got to also recognize that there are those who, even if they are afraid of it, but who want to see that vision, who are in that vision, that they're willing to just step up and be like, okay, I'm going to use my privilege to make sure that the folks that the rest of the country seems to be afraid of, that we're willing to actually amplify their voices, but also monetize their ability to do what needs to be done in their own communities. Because at this point, I don't fully, trust the largesse. I don't at all trust the largesse of people. I put my faith in God, and that's pretty much it. But I feel like those of us who are in the position of, and this is, I'm squarely on USGBC, since you asked, to be like, okay, how do we talk to the people that pay attention to us and say, you need to be looking at these communities in completely different, non-paternalistic ways that you've looked at them before, which means they get, there's access to capital that they've traditionally been denied, which means that there's access to resources they've traditionally been denied, so that they can absolutely be able to do their own thing. That's really, I think, some of the pieces that, we have to literally look at and then go, okay, how do we get those kind of resources into the hands of folks so they can be a part of what happens themselves?
Hello, Majora. This is George Bandy. How are you?
I'm fabulous, George. So nice to meet you.
So I'm actually having goosebumps over here, but to just pivot your conversation in another direction, I agree. And I also think that there is the responsibility for those of us who may have the ability to nudge those people who are in those positions, or to create the type of strategy to begin to enlighten and share the importance of this, especially at this moment, because I think that there's two fears going on at the same time. It is those traditional fears that we are so well aware of that manifest themselves into these things, but it's also the fear of the COVID and its experience and what's going to happen after the fact, and the investment in infrastructure. And at that point, as you stated, we need to be at the table having a conversation related to the value of bringing this about in a way where you're influencing it and also holding people accountable for that influence. And of course, Ozzie, in your post, you asked who gets the credit. I think the communities, Mother Nature, and all of us who have the best interest for future generations are the ones who actually have earned the credit in this particular point, and we owe it. It's not something that we can take credit for. It's something that's a manifestation of our obligation and commitment to the organizations that have been doing this work. So thank you guys so much, and I just wanted to say I concur with all the powerful people who have already spoken.
So thank you all. There's an incredible amount of chat, not just from participants, but from some of our other challengers that's in the chat. So please make sure you're looking there as well. I have to pivot to our next summary just so that we can keep on time. We're running a little bit behind. So we're going to turn it over now to affordability and economic empowerment summary. And this one now is definitely Marge and Emily Andrews. So if you could give a quick summary of yesterday, and then we'll turn it over to our challengers. And also maybe we could hear from some other challengers that we've not heard from as well, and give voice there. So Marge and Emily, kick us off.
Great. Thank you, Ryan. Thanks so much to all of our keepers of the heart and challengers for some really robust discussion. This is really exciting. to hear so many great concepts and ideas. And I'm really enjoying the conversation. Our topic was affordability and economic empowerment yesterday. And to me, that really means that we need to make sure that our buildings are, and especially where we live, need to be both green and affordable. We all deserve green and healthy homes and communities, and we all deserve to be a part of the green economy and to benefit from the transition to cleaner and to a better environment and a better future. So how can USGBC be part of that solution? What can we change? Where can we be a lever or push a lever to make change, which is kind of what I heard George saying. Our panelists yesterday shared some ideas, and so I'm just going to summarize the first two, and then I'm going to turn it over to Marge to cover the second two. So we heard from Anvi Jamdar, the director of Emerald Cities in San Francisco, and she talked to us about the Building Electrification Equity Project, which was basically a 6-month planning process in San Francisco to engage the environmental and climate justice community in the building electrification movement. And this is really key. We've talked a lot about inclusion. We have to ensure that equity issues are incorporated in state and local policies when it comes to building electrification, which is an important part of transitioning to a clean energy economy. And we have to make sure that the community and the workers are engaged in a number of recommendations that we provide online building electrification and equity resources, that there are informational webinars available for different regions and organizations to develop policy around this and to design effective community engagement, to reduce gaps in building electrification research, to understand the costs associated with that, and to fund equity first building electrification pilots. Also, ensure that national environmental justice and climate justice networks participate in the national building electrification policy or the development of policy and any program conversations around that. And then also to develop HVAC training for disadvantaged workers, increase capacity in the clean energy and building electrification industry, and embed those requirements for diversity in that space. So lots of good ideas from Anvi there. I've probably heard this also from a couple other people today, but that the engagement of the community has to be an iterative process. It's not just a one-time engagement, but it has to be thoughtful and sustainable and ongoing. And I thought that was an important thing to point out. Our second presenter was Sanford Garner, who's the president and founding partner of RG Collaborative. And he talked about a redevelopment project in Indianapolis. It was the Fall Creek Place, the neighborhood. It was a public-private partnership covering about 42 blocks that began in 1998 and was finally completed in 2014. And the project goal was to transform a blighted neighborhood into a thriving and safe one, to create a balanced and mixed income and diverse community and provide home ownership opportunities to low and moderate income homeowners. So a big challenge there. He shared some lessons learned from the project and just inherent redevelopment early on in the process. So like gentrification issues, equity issues need to be addressed early on. Community support is essential prior to completion. Expertise is important to have it. Design quality and just quality period in a mixed income development. You have to have that in place, and that financial incentives are also needed to make that happen, which I think is some of what Majora was also talking about. So I am going to leave it at that and let Marge sum up the second two presentations.
Cool. Thanks, Emily. Hey, good morning to all you change agents out there. One of the things that really struck me about this panel is it put together the two issues of the affordability and housing crisis that we have in the United States, especially, and then our growing economic inequity. We had a great presentation from Sarah Hill at the Association for Energy Affordability on equitable electrification, and she's really focused on the opportunities of electrification in frontline communities. From a climate change perspective, 70 million homes and buildings are still burning fossil fuels, which is more NOx emissions than all the power plants in the United States, and the multifamily buildings are being left behind. So she pointed out some different tactics that they're experimenting with in California. And one that really jumped out at me was solar credits to the utility account holders, so that the dollars and the credits for the solar go right back to the people who are renting in our multifamily homes, and that we really have to be much more intentional about designing investments and incentive programs that are specifically targeting low-income multifamily properties in ways that make sense for them. And then we had a great presentation by Chun-Yi Yip at Lend-Lease about the work that Lend-Lease is doing starting in Chicago to try to address both the labor shortage that we have in the built environment and also the underrepresentation of minorities and women. And this is, the other side of the economic equation is pushing family supporting wages so that people earn enough money to be able to afford to live someplace. So they're working not just with local partnerships, but also to recruit in underserved communities and then provide wraparound support services so that they can support job seekers who can't afford transportation or childcare, who get some of the soft skills training before they come in. And that led to some really spicy chat in our group, which I also have been watching our chat heat up here as we get a little tougher on these equity issues. And a couple of the questions that really jumped out to me were, as if we're design professionals, how do we push equity if that's not exactly what our client is asking for? It really reminded me of, to Susan's point this morning, about that teenager energy that USGBC had when we were first starting out. We really broke the mold in this movement about green is too expensive or it's just for hippies. We also broke the mold around how much research and energy was needed to figure out what materials go in buildings that will kill people. We are uniquely positioned, I think, to start to take that kind of energy and commitment and hard work and tackle the equity issue. We also kind of asked our panelists and our participants, if you had a wish list to hand to USGBC, what would that look like? And a couple of ideas that came up I thought were really compelling were workforce standards for LEED, doubling down in low-income affordable housing communities, because if we can prove and scale green building there, there's no more argument that green's too expensive, and being really proactive and intentional. And I guess I, like some of the other panelists, was up a lot last night, but mostly what kept me up wasn't the summit, which filled me full of hope and cheerfulness, but the news, which is, we're having a pretty tough week this week. And I think the call to us is, from this summit, is really structural racism is not going to dismantle itself. And we talked a lot about language yesterday, about whether you use the word frontline communities or inclusion, and when's it appropriate to use words like minority. But I think what we didn't really get to is when do we really talk about structural racism, and go right hand in hand with that. I think economic inequality is deliberate. It creates these default conditions that Dr. Martin talked about this morning, so that it becomes a habit that we've come into, because it's the structure and the place that we've come into. But that's also true about buildings that were bad for the environment, right? So let's tackle this. Let's use this as a big call to prove equity works in the toughest places and really have our movement double down in things like affordable housing. One of the things I took away from the Emerald Cities presentation was this moral economy concept, and that economic ownership that we've just been talking about for the past couple of hours has to stay in the communities, and that it's about earning trust. Our movement really needs to go in there and do the work that earns trust and design at the beginning to prevent some of the negative consequences. So I guess the challenge I have for our community is, if it's not us, who? We've already solved some pretty gnarly technical problems. Let's go do everything that we can at the local level and at scale to try to solve some of these more difficult questions by being really intentional. And I'll just call out, my favorite quote by Tony Juniper: "It is too late for pessimism." There's a lot of work to be done, so let's go do it.
I'm going to channel my best Kimberly Lewis and say preach on that one. So let's turn it over now for some reactions from our champions and challengers. I know, Nathaniel, you've been chomping at the bit to say a few things, so maybe I'll put you on the spot if you'd like to kick us off.
Yes, so thank you for providing an opportunity for us to come together and talk about a critical issue, such a critical issue at this particular point in our history. There are a couple of things. I mean, both sections of the conversation have been very, very thought-provoking to me. There are a couple of things I wanted to share. First, USGBC has to understand, in my opinion, and the members of USGBC, that generating equity within the context of physical infrastructure is not enough. The built environment, and even when we talk about creating a clean energy economy, is one thing, but it's also about how can you use your ability to actually facilitate a strong civic infrastructure, not just the physical infrastructure, but the civic infrastructure of communities, and actually utilize your projects and economic development strategies as an opportunity to galvanize community, organize the community, and help to facilitate authentic voice from that community. The second thing is that equity is not just a destination, but it's also a journey. In understanding that as you move towards that destination, which is equity within the context of your projects, what are you putting into place to ensure, again, that there are opportunities for community voice and other key policies and considerations that will create the conditions for the authentic wisdom and experience of community to be included in the process? We have all of these kind of meta conversations about the history of structural racism. In any community that you're working in, there's a local history. There's a local history of disenfranchisement. There's a local history of structural racism. What is that history? It is your responsibility to get to know that history, and the primary way that you can do that is through the people. And last but certainly not least, as I think through these presentations, when we talk about helping to cultivate the civic infrastructure of community, we also have to think to ourselves whether, as we advance racial equity or social equity, are we just talking about navigation or transformation? Are we just focused on creating opportunities for people to navigate through an economy that has historically not worked for them, or land use decision-making and policies that have not worked for them? Or are we actually trying to work together to create the conditions where we can experience a just transition and also potentially a new economy that can work for everyone? So those are some things that I thought about as I listened to the presentation.
This is George.
Go for it.
Nathaniel, in regards to the statement that you made, can you elaborate a little bit on going beyond just the infrastructure? You talked about going into civic areas. Can you elaborate a little bit more on how you see that becoming manifested, or are there other things other than just civic issues that we can address as well?
Yeah, so I think that throughout and it's good to hear your voice too, George. I want to make sure I say that too.
Good to see you,
yeah, good to see you, man. So throughout the development process, there are opportunities to actually include and hear and leverage the wisdom of the community. I think a lot of times people in particular who have been disenfranchised and disinvested in are usually asked to engage in processes on the back end versus the front end. So are there opportunities to actually develop and cultivate opportunities for not just input from the community, but to also create opportunity to actually develop and cultivate the agency, the civic agency of communities as you progress through the development process, or whether it be land use or economic development process? As an organization, a partnership with Southern Equity, we spend a great deal of time doing leadership development work through our efforts, because we're always committed to doing what we can to leave something behind. And it's not just about leaving buildings behind, but can you also work to leave power behind and influence for the communities that you're engaging with?
I want to amplify that leave power behind, because I think there's some chat about savior complex and words like charity and those kind of things, but I think this is a fundamental paradigm shift for people of privilege to think about stepping aside and becoming a resource and a supporter, and allowing the folks that we're trying to serve thrive and reap the majority of the benefits.
Well, thank you both for your summary and for our challengers. We are going to move on to our very last out-of-the-box session for our summary there from Tracy Ryder and Amy King.
Great. Thank you, Ryan. I just want to thank everybody, all of you, all of the panelists, all the challengers, all the organizers, and all the attendants for this incredible discussion that we're having. So our out-of-the-box session yesterday was really diverse in scale and topic, but it did speak to some themes to me of communities and support, both in providing and receiving support. One theme that ran through 3 of our presentations, the group from Austin Energy, Green Building, SFI, and USGBC's Haiti project specifically, was the notion of engaging communities to actively help them with different levels of investment and equity. So granted, I'm coming to the sessions from a community engaged research perspective, which is what I do in my life, with an emphasis on health equity, and so I want to own that lens. So that's what all of my responses kind of have that lens. We've heard a lot about community engagement from the previous recaps, and Denise Fairchild, as a challenger, earlier mentioned co-governing. Nathaniel just talked about civic engagement and ensuring these transformations could work for everyone. In the work we're doing with community engaged research, this is a very intentional decision, the understanding the community and what they actually want, what actually works for them, and how to empower these different communities. And it's been seen in the varying degrees of presentations from yesterday. We're a wonderful organization of wonderful people, and we just get so excited to throw in our energy and help, and we just jump right in, which is incredible, and it's a great thing we need to celebrate. But as addressed with some of our sessions and questions from yesterday, it's about how we engage the communities meaningfully and not parachuting in to fix issues of equity. One of the quotes that I just want to share is, civic engagement means working to make a difference in the civic life of our communities and developing the combination of knowledge, skills, values, and motivation to make that difference. It means promoting the quality of life in a community through both political and non-political processes. And that's from Thomas Ehrlich, who's at Stanford. And I think that's what we try and do, at least in our design, education, and outreach work in terms of health equity. So build it not just in terms of infrastructure, like Nathaniel mentioned, but in terms of civic engagement and leaving something behind. So with that, we're going to do a couple of quick overviews of the panels. The first session was Navigating High Performance Technology and Gender Equity in Building Engineering from Sarah Neff and Jessica Rebick with Kilroy Realty Corporation. And that was a discussion around gender equity and the sustainability professions, which is a very particular, detailed topic, but one that's certainly outside the traditional USGBC box. We heard how a young female engineer is helping Kilroy Realty Corporation, one of the highest performing REITs, achieve major sustainability targets by bringing high performance building technology to a 70-year-old asset while navigating a very male-dominated industry. The discussion and questions around this session were around gender barriers to equity in building engineering, specifically a lack of awareness of the role for women in the profession, the profession being highly competitive and without female role models, so many women simply don't know it's an option. The discussion shifted to the discussion of how to better engage engineers in the green building process and started to edge on the notion of gender and involvement in green building. Questions around the tasks and roles of building engineers were addressed, specifically around how building engineers are forced to resolve complaints and put out fires, and rarely get the opportunity to be proactive. And so questions in the chat box are about how we shift that, and then it turned into an engagement issue, actually, looking at how facility managers and building engineers have really great advice during design. They just need to be involved and have a process for hearing them in the design community being willing to listen. The second session explored a quantitative approach to equity, looking at the normalization of equity through a checklist approach to green building at Austin Energy Green Building. Green building professionals have been using design as a powerful tool to creatively find solutions to society's greatest challenges. Equity is one of these challenges. Austin Energy Green Building seeks to formulaically normalize, organize, and operationalize a campaign to make green buildings more equitable by design. The discussion and questions around this presentation were about establishing equity as a shared value and beginning to normalize it with a focus on racial equity. The intent was to establish a set of shared definitions to normalize their use. The panel pointed out that discussing race and gender can be uncomfortable, but providing support and exposing the green building community to the language of equity is one of the most important steps in moving this topic forward. Equity is not the same as diversity and inclusion, which is important, but doesn't get us to equity. Questions were about the implementation and how communities were engaged, and the group said that they did take into account geography and redlining issues and intersections with race, like gender or class, but really focused largely on race. The third session, Kathy Abasal, President and CEO of the Sustainable Forestry Initiative, spoke to how sustainable forests and green buildings create social equity, and we moved from green building equity checklists within a community to another approach to community engagement, looking at SFI community grants and curriculum. Her presentation focused on innovative partnerships and the creation of systems that help ensure equity and diversity in sourcing materials to increase connections between the forest supply chain and buildings to improve social equity in rural and urban communities. Discussions from this third presentation asked for organizations that care about social equity to be intentional about the products they source. SFI has written a policy demonstrating a commitment to comply with social laws, respect the rights of workers, requirements around gender equity, and diversity and inclusion. They collaborate with African American forest landowners to maintain working forests while getting a revenue stream from their forest and promoting sustainable forestry practices. And they also prioritize working with indigenous communities. Amy's going to talk about the last two.
Okay, thanks, Tracy. So just how Tracy talked about what her lens is, I thought I'd just share briefly who I am. I now live in Dallas, Texas, which I consider to be one of the most segregated cities in the US, and doing some work with social entrepreneurs. And my lens is also having been former USGBC staff working post-Katrina, Hurricanes Katrina and Rita on a whole bunch of different initiatives and having a lot of lessons learned there, some of which were alluded to throughout our sessions. So our fourth session transitioned along the theme of community empowerment and equity to talk about community culture and equity through USGBC's Haiti project, which was building an orphanage in Haiti. And we had Roger Limoges, Senior Vice President of Market Transformation and Development from USGBC. He shared with us some lessons learned on the project. USGBC made a commitment to help Haiti build back better, and they started working in the country without any relationships or cultural knowledge. They were determined to build this project LEED Platinum, and Roger shared, he was extremely transparent about what worked and what didn't. They thought they were going to be in and out in 2 years. It ended up being a 10-year project, which is pretty remarkable. Construction completed in 2019. It's certified LEED Platinum, and the first group of children arrived in mid-April, and he showed some pretty amazing photos of some children in the facility. So he also said they, in the beginning, did more listening than talking, and by the time they got to listening to the partners' needs, they largely made the plan. And they thought they knew what equity meant for them and what would be best, but they just couldn't have comprehended the Haitian context. People were afraid to be inside of their homes after the earthquake. They had to challenge all of their initial assumptions as people going into Haiti. And some of the big lessons learned: to adapt, listen, remain open, and building trust is key, especially because they didn't look like the community that they wanted to help. A lot of other people had never followed through on the commitments that they had made to the people of Haiti. So they had to build personal relationships and trust from the beginning. And one technical thing that I just thought was remarkable: they designed the building to completely operate off of the Haitian electric grid, and they have drinkable tap water. So Roger was asked about how they're using the building to educate in Haiti. Did they employ Haitian architects or green sustainable professionals? And he said that they worked with a Haitian construction firm and all local labor for the project. And another question, getting deeper into the bigger issues about being responsive after a disaster versus USGBC potentially being more proactive toward resilience with communities in front of disasters. How to transition from disaster response to be proactive. He said that Roger thought the best approach was embedding people with knowledge and keep building with lead to redouble our equity efforts. And a really good example of something, a case where this has been done, is we embedded Anissa Hemming in New Orleans, and she worked directly with local professionals on green building education and community building. So Roger thought that was a really good model moving forward. And another question was, how do you avoid the Messiah complex? Something that's been talked about a lot today. And share experiences with these groups instead of colonizing them with our own vision of how life, happiness, and well-being should look. Roger shared that he thinks it's important to start in a community by listening and understand that it's important, and understand what's important to the community, what their priorities are, and if they feel that the partnership would be helpful to them. So, wide array of issues under this umbrella of equity, and Roger really spoke from the heart on this, shared a lot of photos of the completed building, and that was Roger's presentation. And next, the last presentation was, are equity and quality of life the same thing? Walker Wells from Ramey and Associates and UCLA in Los Angeles presented. He shared that Lead for Cities and Communities rating system is making really great strides in recognizing the multi-dimensions of urban sustainability. It's challenging to address equity in the context of a LEED rating system, but he's talking about expanding the quality of life section. The prerequisites and credits are becoming more robust and more effective at identifying principles that need to be committed to by any community using the rating system. And he talked a lot about how do we identify inequity, examining disparities in the distribution of burdens and benefits and access to amenities, opportunities, and power. This new category for LEED would be quality of life. Available and data and metrics are focused on negative outcomes. So it's hard to find positive indicators. They're fundamental aspects of creating an equitable and inclusive society, human and civil rights, access to education and jobs, et cetera. And Walker also wanted to make sure that we had history as a context here, and talking about how when you look at current city plans, it's incredibly self-evident by how the cities are set up that the redlining history is still present. I remember Majora Carter's presentation back at a Greenbuild where she was talking about the redlining in her community and what a tremendous long-term effect that's had in the work that she's doing there. And I referred to a short film that I think everyone should watch called Segregated by Design. It's segregatedbydesign.com. If you haven't seen it, that's really good history and context. So let's see, Walker went through some credit structures and a question that was asked of him, and then I'll tie this up. Everyone on the call is comfortable with the word equity, but I've experienced that it's a lightning rod to certain people. Is there a potential word to use instead of equity for those who have a negative reaction? And Walker concluded saying it involves, I think a lot of it involves this piece around normalizing and not expecting people of color to explain what equity is. A lot of relationship building is needed to normalize this conversation, and then organize others with a shared analysis to kind of reach a tipping point if leadership or partners aren't engaging in equitable work. Really meaty subject there, a lot of further potential with LEAD for cities and communities that we could get into. It could be a whole day session. So in summary, whether bringing LEAD to the table, either as an outsider or in your community, we talked about how it's so important to be intentional and truly listen and ensure that deep context and history of place and culture are also considered, when we work toward increased equity. And the USGBC community, as we work to make communities greener and more resilient, needs to take a deep dive into the nature of the inequities, and that nothing is a one-size-fits-all situation. Roger Limoges from the Haiti Project shared that how no project is perfect or cookie cutter, and that walking meaningfully alongside people is the best way to ensure that there's more transparency and love on any project or collaboration.
Great, thank you, Amy and Tracy. We are running just a few moments over, so turn it to our challengers. Somebody?
Yeah, it's Dianne.
Yeah.
Super fast to Amy. Just to the points that you were concluding and where you started, I'm a fourth generation Dallas native. And if you look at I-75, I haven't lived in Dallas for over 50 years, but I-75, which used to be the Central Expressway, was the seriously demarcation dividing line.
Yep.
Okay. And so it is in a microcosm in one place, the living example of what you were speaking to in terms of the different pieces about the legacies that get brought forward and how we really have to figure out ways to not overwhelm what we're trying to do, but put those pieces of that history in the context, because absent that, we don't come with any of with the sufficiency of sensitivities that we need to have to understand that we're not coming in as a messiah, but we're coming in to be part of the community.
Thank you so much for saying that. And it's even worse that I-75 is named after one of the most racist people in from the history of Dallas. There's a lot of petitions to change the name. But my co-working community, my business is actually located on South Good Latimer Expressway, and we're right, practically underneath a freeway overpass, and just kind of at the center of a bridge between South Dallas and downtown and Deep Ellum. And kind of we're doing that work of having those conversations. I've learned so much just by working. 40% of our membership is African American, and it's messy work, but we're learning how to work together and be together in community, which is a first step, I think.
Dianne, thank you for kicking that off. Other comments from our challengers and champions for this summary?
Hi, this is Ozzie, and I put the comment into the chat, but I think it's worth bringing to the table at this time. And it goes back to education and curriculum of our design and planning professionals. We don't have, and I'm sorry, I can't seem to get my camera to kick on right now. I'm going to try that in a sec again. But the curriculum that we still bring to our young professionals in schools is still applying some basic principles of planning and design that don't emphasize the importance of having the community help define the design problem or bringing that visibility in those voices. And the planning principles are still really looking at how we use zoning and planning in the sort of historic model of assuming people are going to work here, live over there, and we don't really embed ourselves in the equity side as much. So what do we need to do within curriculum so that these issues are being brought as the new way that design and planning is considered successful?
I feel like that's probably up my alley since I'm in the curriculum world in the School of Architecture, and I'm watching some of the comments go up. But yeah, we absolutely need to change the paradigm Part of my dissertation when I did it was about kind of breaking the box of how we were all taught to build buildings and what we were taught to consider. A lot of the schools around here, or a lot of the schools in general for architecture, don't even use post-occupancy evaluations for how your building's actually going to operate for the people that are in them, much less for the communities at large, and engaging them in what they actually want versus what we think they should have. So I completely agree with what you're saying. That's kind of my torch that I take to every faculty meeting and to our ACSA meetings around the country. And that's what almost all of my papers are on interdisciplinary work and community engagement. And it is growing. There are more papers like that at some of the conferences, but it's not fast enough. It's largely a group that is, how can I say this? They just teach the way they've been taught, and they're typically older, and they come from a certain background, and that's how they're trying to teach the new round. There are a lot though that aren't, right. So there are some of us. There are a lot of us that are doing public interest engagement. There are a lot of us that are doing community and coastal resilient design, working in communities to do some really deep kind of community engagement and listening before they start to plan and understand. So it's starting to happen. I just really wish it was happening faster. And any of you that want to work with me on this, ping me, any of it, all of it. I'm ready. Write papers, conferences, whatever. But I feel you.
Ryan, this is Antoine. Can I jump in?
Yeah, please.
It's like double dutch. I get where you fit in. To respond to Ozzie and to Dr. Ryder, so when it comes down to architectural planning education, NOMA has had a conversation with ACSA, Association of Collegiate Schools of Architecture, about this very subject. And I'm glad to say that they've got some new leadership in place that is actively looking at changing the curriculum for architecture school. I mean, I was taught that 20 years ago, just like Jess was, right? And much of that has not changed. But I can say with confidence that education and that paradigm is definitely shifting now. A lot of it is because there are individuals like Dr. Ryder and others that are aggressively pushing the issue, but there's also some pretty passionate alumni from some of the universities that are pushing back. And that's something that, for no one wants to say it all the time, but dollars help move the issues. And so we've been actively involved in some of our schools of architecture and for planning. And then going back to some points that Nathaniel meant and some others about the civic engagement, I like to think that we heard quite a bit about civic engagement yesterday, and most of it was very good. I think it's important that we push the envelope to civic empowerment so that we are actually including our residents in our communities in the decision-making process as decision makers and not just people that are sharing their opinion. I think it's important that they're on these TERS boards, they're on our TIF boards, they're on our planning commissions. That's how we are able to affect civic change and physical change. I had to miss the last 3 hours yesterday because I serve at our planning commission here in Houston. And as one of only two blacks on a commission that has 24 people, I do everything I can to make sure I go to every single planning commission that we have. And I think it's vitally important that we're actively involved in the empowerment and the creation of our communities. I'm going to talk a lot about this in a session. So I know we're running short, but I'm glad to hear where this is going. And Dr. Ryder, we'll talk later.
Yeah, man, I'm all about it. I know that some of our NOMA student members should be on the chat today, so that's great.
Fantastic. Well, we're going to shortly transition over to hearing directly and with a dedicated moment from each of our champions and challengers over the next little while. But for all of our keepers of the heart, champions and challengers, thank you for this. We will continue the conversation throughout the day. So if there's any closing thoughts, Amy and Tracy, for your section, we can close it out and move from there.
I did all my closings at the beginning. I drew all my good stuff in my statement and my quote. So
I just had one thing. I just want to conclude by asking, how are we measuring our impact and success with our partners in these communities to ensure that we're truly raising the quality of life for our stakeholders? There's been a lot of talk about measurement and kind of co-measurement. And let's just smash that box and continue to have bold, candid conversations today. Thanks.
Thank you all.